We all have a story to tell. Let's tell yours. Welcome to the Intellectual People Podcast with your host, Jason. Come together and listen to journey stories and more from interesting people. Welcome your host, Jason.
Today on the Intellectual People Podcast, I have Alison Morrow. How are you doing today, Alison?
Hey, I'm good. Thanks again for the invite.
Thanks for coming. Alison, tell us who you are.
Who am I currently, or who I used to be?
All of it.
Currently, I'm a mom of a 15-month-old. I have 2 horses. I was a dog owner until my pup of 12 years died in March, which has been quite a significant event actually for me and who I am now. Um, I left my TV news career in 2019 for about 13 years. I was in mainstream media. I've worked at Fox News Channel. I have been a local news reporter. I was most recently an environmental reporter in Seattle at King, which is the NBC affiliate. And I got to a point where I was sort of in the midst of a crisis of both professional and personal conscience and decided to quit and move to the country. I was done. I was along with my husband, done living in a city. We wanted a simpler life. We wanted land, quiet, peace, and the opportunity to be a little bit more self-sufficient. This was before COVID. It turned out to be a good decision. We didn't realize how good of a decision it was to get out of Seattle at the time. And I also was having concerns about going on television and people perceiving me as an authority on subjects that I felt like there were a lot of unknowns that I didn't have time or resources to find the answers. And I presented to my bosses an option of letting me kind of reformat my position, which would have given me the opportunity to also live somewhere where I wanted to live, but also report in a different way, have more time to do research, more time to present the research, because one thing we get into is in television news, really 90 seconds is kind of the cutoff for any story. It was just very hard to cover something complex like the environment in that amount of time. And the fact I only had a couple hours a day to do it, I was doing everything: shooting, editing, writing, going on camera, all of it, driving the car. There just was very little time to know what I was talking about, frankly. So when I switched off of mainstream news and decided to start doing media analysis on my YouTube channel, which is now turned into many other platforms due to censorship, I didn't really know where I was going with it, but I knew that the one thing I could offer people is an insight into how mainstream newsrooms work, at the very least, so that you don't just make your life or death decision, or whether you're going to talk to grandma or how you're going to vote or all these things just based on what you see in mainstream news. I wanted people to know how difficult even the most well-meaning reporter's life is in a mainstream newsroom, so that, maybe it isn't just like always this conspiracy cabal trying to brainwash America. It's a bunch of people who don't have time to know what they're talking about anyway, even if they wanted to know what they were talking about, which not everybody does, but there are some people who do. And like myself, I just felt like I just didn't have time to do it. So I think that sums it up. I could go into a lot greater detail, but that gives you a little bit of a picture of where I'm at now.
Great. And I definitely do want to get into it deeper as the show goes on. Were you always interested in journalism?
I was always interested in shooting videos. When I was a little kid, I got a camera and I made videos at the barn. I've always ridden horses ever since I was a really little kid. And my parents would, drop me off Saturday mornings where my horse was boarded, and I had my camera, and I was kind of a punk. So I would do these videos. I titled them Psycho Girl. I wish I had some of them still, but I would like play pranks on my friends and their horses, and I'd make these videos, and then we'd have like watch parties and stuff. And I just love shooting videos. And I was definitely a troublemaker. I think as I got older, the troublemaker turned into somebody more like a skeptic, kind of an outsider in wanting to understand how the world works, and not accepting things the way that they are. And the camera part of it turned into a journalist. I think because of my change in attitude I went from, like I said, being a punk to somebody who was trying to turn the punkism into critical thinking skills. And so, yeah, it just sort of led me to television journalism because I really liked working with video. Now, obviously, digital platforms allow for video journalism. You don't have to work for a TV newsroom, but at the time, that was not something that was mainstream. Obviously, the internet was pretty new, and so at first I thought, well, if I want to make a big difference in the world, I should go national because that's the biggest audience. And so that's how I ended up at Fox News Channel. My first internship just happened to be at a Fox O&O, and then I, just moved up the ladder and ended up at Fox News Channel in New York City when I was 21. And that was an experience. I learned how that works. I think it's a little bit different, if not a lot different than what it was like when I was there. But I saw how politically biased cable newsrooms work, and I didn't really, towards the end, when I decided to quit, it wasn't necessarily because I knew about it what I know now. It was more so that I didn't like sitting in a newsroom. I was a producer. I didn't really like sitting in a newsroom. I was booking guests all the time and just like writing cue cards and questions for the anchors. And then they would do whatever they wanted with the show. And I was like, why am I here? I'm writing these questions. I'm trying to do the research. And then the anchors, whatever their bias was or whatever they felt like was going to sell for the audience, that's what they would do. And it felt like I was pointless. All I was doing was just booking cars for guests and getting them in. And so because I just hadn't really thought through like what other options were, and I really didn't want to be on camera. I liked, the video side of things. I left TV news. I got a Master of Divinity degree, studied psychology and counseling as a subsect of my degree, and was going to get a PhD in psychology and be a therapist. That was like my next best thing that I could think of. And it was a preaching class I took my last year of divinity school, which I tried to get out of, but they forced me to take it in order to graduate, where my preaching professor got me really thinking about journalism and the way that narratives are framed and how that has an effect on the communities that are telling those stories or repeating those narratives. And it gave me kind of, I guess, another layer of purpose for a career that had felt very purposeless towards the end. And that's when I decided to get back into it as a reporter. I figured, well, I really like working with video. I'd like to stick with this world of journalism. I guess I'll do the on-camera thing. I didn't really like doing that, but at the time, you could also do these other things I like to do, shoot video and stuff, because when the recession hit in 2008, that was when reporters were like handed cameras and the news manager said, you got to figure out how to do this. And it also became kind of destructive, obviously, because you lost a ton of time. They were expanding live broadcasting. So now you have a 4 o'clock show versus the 6:30 that you had a couple more hours to prepare for, and now you're doing all these other jobs. So on the one hand, it has hurt journalism in some cases. In other ways, it gave me the opportunity to be an environmental journalist, because I don't think that beat would have existed if I had to take a photographer with me. They wouldn't have been able to afford the resources. They would have said, no, we need that person at city council, so you need to go to city council. So the fact that I could shoot, I could edit, I could do all that stuff, and I like to do it, that gave me the opportunity to go, see wolverines released into, the wild, or to hike summits looking for, whatever den of whatever wild animal we were looking for, because I didn't have to take a photographer with me. So it was a double-edged sword. But that eventually I think was where I felt I fit the most, when I was in it. And I really enjoyed the time I got to do that video journalism when I had the ability to do it, appropriately for the subject matter. I think the days that were really frustrating were days where it wasn't necessarily a fun video shoot in the sense that, some stories, it's like they're very visual. Like I said, you go on a wild animal release or something for endangered species recovery. That's really cool. It doesn't require a ton of intellectual engagement, in the sense that I don't have to do a ton of research on it. And the visuals carry the story. Now, switch that over to the Clean Water Act. You're covering something that's very complex, very dense. It's not visual, and you don't have time to read because you're trying to drive all over the place to get interviews. I remember like one of the last stories that I really got, it was very disenchanting for me, was about the Clean Water Act specifically. Actually, I came back, I couldn't read the Senate report I needed to read. And one of the people that I sat next to who had been in the business, this was an anchor who had been in the business for decades. I said, I can't read this report, and I'm frustrated. I'm going to go on air without knowing, what was in this. And her advice was to just repeat what NBC News was saying. To me, that was a terrible idea for multiple reasons, not the least of which is that I was one of the only, if not the only, full-time television news reporter covering the environment at the time for a TV station in the entire country. And there's no way a reporter in New York City knew more than I did about the environment. Even in the little bit that I knew about, the intricacies of the Clean Water Act, I still knew more about how these things were affecting, local communities and stuff because I lived in them. And that was what I did every single day. So just repeating talking points from the affiliate in New York City, that was not an acceptable answer. And the more that I started to know what I didn't know, the more I started seeing the holes in my reporting, the more I was like, I just can't do this anymore. And then I started doing stories that were just overly simple just to stay away from anything that would put me in a world that I felt like I didn't have the authority to discuss. And then the job was just boring, because here I am just talking about plastic water bottles when I really want to be talking about complex issues, but I just don't have the time to do it. So I felt like, both of my parents are doctors. They have the saying, do no harm, right? So that was kind of the end of the end for me. It was like when I realized like I'm just doing no harm every day. That's what I'm coming in to do. Forget it. That's not a raison d'etre for me.
Understood. Take us into the back room of a major news network and the producer's job and the steps to get to that end result, if you would.
A producer's job specifically, you mean like at Fox, like cable newsroom?
Correct.
Well, honestly, producers are at the vast majority of them are more like what you would consider a booker. So you get together in the morning, you go over the topics you want to cover in the show, and then everybody is assigned a segment. That's typically how it works. So you have
Okay.
segment producers, and then you'll have a senior producer and executive producer that are looking at the whole show. But the vast majority of the producers are a segment producer, which is what I was. So you're given your topic. You have to decide what guest you're going to book for that topic. Maybe you're booking two because you're going to have a debate over it. And you call them up and you ask them if they're free from this time to this time. And then you book the car for them. And if they're local, otherwise you figure out how to set up their shot at if they're at a newsroom somewhere else in the country,
Okay.
get all the technical sides together, and then you put together anchor packets with research on the latest updates on your particular issue. Say it's Afghanistan, you're looking at the basics like how many troops do we have there right now? What's the deadline? What happened in Kabul? All that stuff, and you're putting it in for the anchors, and then you write their questions too. What about this? What about that? And the thing is that they just don't necessarily go by that. So you could be somebody who's written a really great segment and some great questions, and if they don't want to ask them, they're not going to ask them. And depending on the guest that you get, it goes one way or another. You're not controlling the guest. So it's a very different experience than like being a reporter in like a local newsroom, especially where you're overseeing your topic from beginning to end. It's like it's your baby, you and then and I like that not just because I had more engagement with what I was doing, but because I didn't really like being a producer because I didn't, as frustrating as it was that they didn't ask my questions or, the segments, but I actually didn't want that. I didn't really want to control people. I still don't. I still
Sure.
don't like controlling people. And a producer has to, that's what you have to like doing really. You have to like telling people what to do. And I just don't like telling people what to do. I don't even like telling my daughter what to do. I've had to grow some boundaries on that one. So I just like doing my own thing. I'm kind of a lone wolf in that regard. So, but I wasn't really an insider. I wasn't a journalism insider. I wasn't a media insider. I was never really a groupie. I didn't even study it in college. I was a history major. And so I didn't really know what I didn't know. Like my whole process in my career, I think was about, it took me to a place where maybe a lot of people get to when they're like 20, because they like, oh, I'm going to research this field that I want to go into. I want to know all about it. I didn't. I just went into it because I like shooting video and it was fun. On one hand, I think that, it took me longer to realize it wasn't for me. But on the other, I realized it wasn't for me because I was not a groupie. I didn't play by the rules, if that makes sense. I was never somebody who felt this identity with the career such that I would bend and break myself for it. When I finally started realizing that that was what it was doing to me, I was like, I'm out of here. And I still have a lot of friends who are in it, even though they're like, they're like abused, really. I mean, they're just like, as one of my friends would say, rode hard and put away wet every day, and they still do it and they complain, they're getting salary cuts and they have less and less time to do their job and they stay. And I think a huge part of it is they just don't see themselves able to do anything else. Their identity is so wrapped up in being a mainstream news reporter or producer having the brand behind them, the peacock or whatever else. They just can't envision themselves outside of it. And it's kind of sad actually, but I was just never that way. I was never a groupie. So the second I realized that something was not right here, I was out of there.
You mentioned a lot of bias. Can you explain how much bias there really is between all the networks?
Yeah, I mean, if you consider what YouTube is now, there are a lot of people who, they've got a particular focus and a particular kind of audience. They know what their audience wants to see and hear. And I've seen it, if you go against your audience's like what they show up for, they're like, I don't want to do this. I don't like what, wait a second, hang on. I thought you were this, or I thought you were that. It's the same thing, but like at a larger scale in mainstream corporate newsrooms. They figured out that instead of trying to market to everybody, they would market to one kind of ideology, but get them really into it. You know what I mean? So it's like, if
Why?
you can sit
Why would they
why
do
would they do that?
Yes,
Money. I mean, it sells.
but
Um,
doesn't appealing to the masses in the end going to create more money rather than appealing to a specific group of people?
I don't think so, not if you look at Fox News Channel. I mean, they're constantly winning because they're the only they have a conservative bias, and for a long time, they were the only ones really that were going that route, and conservatives felt like there was a subtle or sometimes obvious liberal bias on the other affiliates. So they all went to Fox. Now Fox they don't like because of the election. So now they're at, now there's new options like OAN or News Newsmax, right? Um, but there's so few. That's why Fox has the audience it does because it's everybody's there versus NBC, CBS, ABC, CNN, MSNBC. They're all splitting the other folks. So you know, you may say that the other, those other stations, maybe trying to appeal to a wider audience would do better, but Fox's decision from a purely financial standpoint to just market to conservatives, obviously that was a successful financial decision for them because they're winning the ratings. They're losing ratings, okay, right now, but they're winning the cable war at this
Right.
point. Um, because like I said, they figured out a market that felt disenfranchised by mainstream news, and they just decided to tell them what they thought they wanted to hear. So just tell them constantly what, they want to hear. And it worked because, then you have an MSNBC that's trying to do the same thing. And are they pulling viewers away from, CNN is still trying to pretend, though they're doing a terrible job. They're still trying to pretend that they're some kind of like mainline objective newsroom, but they're losing to an MSNBC that's just like full out, mainline Democrat. So, I don't like it, but if you're just talking finances, identifying a market, branding yourself for the market, it's not that different again from like what a lot of people in new media are doing. It can be just as bad for intellectual debate and cognitive dissonance and all that stuff in the new media world. Like Fox, and MSNBC or whatever, obviously they have they've got a lot more money behind them than the average independent journalist, but are they doing something that's that different than what a lot of independent journalists are doing? I don't know. I think it can be just as bad in the new media world.
Do you believe that journalists and mainstream media are intentionally missing key points in certain stories intentionally?
Yes. I would have said no. I would have said no before COVID, I think. But and maybe even probably somewhere in the middle of Trump's presidency, or maybe not even the middle, maybe the beginning, before he was even elected, it became very obvious that there was what I call uh, value by moral dissociation or journalism by moral dissociation. In other words, when I first started, and even at the end for me, but I noticed it was very different for a lot of my peers. My idea of journalism was that you were looking for the unpopular ideas. You were looking for the dissent. You were looking for the interesting people that were, that weren't like the rest of everybody else. Because that was journalism. It was trying to understand how people who don't think like everybody else think. That was the cool part of it all, was that you could just interview, people who like everyone else thought were just totally weird because it was interesting to hear from them. Well, like somehow Trump became such a significant danger in the mainstream journalism world. Like journalists really felt like he was this unique danger that they had to go the opposite direction, which was, now if you're really a journalist, if you're a gatekeeper, you're a moral crusader for the truth, now you do the opposite and you block ideas that you consider to be fringe, dangerous, disinformation, liars, whatever. Now, not to say that we didn't like, hey, that person's lying or whatever. We didn't do that before, but the industry became much more hawkish about it with his presidency. The New York Times was pretty open about that even before the election. That they wrote an article with a headline that said that he's challenging the rules of objectivity and that journalists are just going to have to do things differently. It's interesting. They ended the article by saying, now, is this going to make his supporters even more distrustful of the news? Probably, but you know what? We got to do it because it's a unique danger. And, they predicted exactly what ended up happening. Look at the amount of distrust that people have now of mainstream. 50% of the country. Sometimes I'm concerned, like we're in such a world of distrust with institutions that and I hear from people that they'd rather walk off a cliff than let NBC tell them that there's a cliff there and you're gonna fall to your death. They would rather just jump off the cliff. Um, and to go back to your point about, did it work, courting a particular audience and promoting bias and that stuff, it did work for a certain amount of time. I would say now people are, you can see with the ratings, especially now that Trump's out and that danger. I mean, they're trying to find other dangers. But you can only do that for so long, because at some point you normalize that and then people are like, over it. And then, you do something that crosses their, you created this particular, I wouldn't say necessarily you just created it, but you helped create this expectation and this bias of your audience. So now you better sell it. And the second that you violate that, well, now you're in trouble because you made them that way, or at least you helped significantly make your audience think that way. So they're not used to you changing course. One of the things I do on my channel is I'm pretty serious about having people on that I know are going to challenge my audience because, even though I do focus on free speech and speech suppression, so it tends to, you'll have a lot of some of the similar ideas simply because, not everybody's censored right now. There's certain kinds of challenges to mainstream narratives that, are the ones that are targeted. And so you'll hear that a lot, but I'm pretty serious about having both, like, Trump and Bernie supporters on to talk about that stuff because I want people to hear, they can hear somebody say Trump was the savior of the world, and then the next interview I want them to hear someone who says Trump is the devil, because I want them to know that I don't, I'm going to listen to whoever is getting
Right.
suppressed, and whoever's saying something. And I don't, I don't think that talking to somebody or listening to somebody is endorsing beliefs. And I think that's another problem with journalism now, when you were talking about intentionally getting things wrong or avoiding certain topics or whatever. Yeah, it's an intentional again, like I said, dissociation based on this sense of morality of silencing voices that you have decided as if you're the expert. And that's a real problem, to go back to my original point about how little journalists know. Hey, if they were omniscient and they had the time and the resources to really know what they were talking about, and if they were like functional parts of society. I mean, a lot of journalists have psychological issues in the sense that, you think it's like when you grow up and you're like, my parents, you think your parents know more than you do, and then you wake up one day, you're 22 or maybe 30 or whatever, and you're like, oh, they're kind of messed up. I actually may know more than my parents. And when you realize that about journalists, a lot of journalists are working out their own issues. They're not necessarily like the healthiest functioning
Sure.
members of society. So it sounds, at first glance, it may sound great for a journalist to be the one who's doing the gatekeeping for you. Oh, we figured out that person's a liar, this person's spreading disinformation, whatever else, until you realize that actually they don't always know what they're talking about, and they're just keeping you from hearing voices that actually may have validity to them. But this journalist with very little understanding of the issue and desire to understand the issue, curiosity about it, because remember, they also think that not being curious is now a value. Okay, not wanting to know what the disinformation is a value.
Right.
um so these are the people that you're trusting with these big decisions. And yeah, the more that it's almost like the more that there's opportunity to get different ideas online in independent sources, the more the mainstream news is like cracking down on the idea of disinformation spreaders, and just making people terrified of getting their information from other sources. I think they're sort of terrified, and that's like kind of a projection on their part. But I really do think they believe that they're doing a service to the world by silencing people that they think are saying the wrong thing. What's funny though is that, if you were to turn the same standards on them every time they've said something that turns out to be untrue, every time they've changed their minds on something just because one or another bureaucratic source now tells them that they're allowed to do that, you know, they're allowed to make mistakes. I think that's the thing that bothers me the most, is that it's not to say that there isn't disinformation out there in independent sources. Of course there is,
Of course.
but there's just, there that happens all the time in mainstream too. So, it's just crazy to me that they hold other people to a standard that they just do not hold themselves to.
Right.
And I think that's something that they really need to pay attention to, because they should really be cleaning up their own living room before they start pointing their fingers at other people.
Good point. I remember when I was a kid, I used to page through some magazines, and there was always in every magazine, like a corrections segment or a portion, right? Where if somebody reported improper information on whatever that article was about, they corrected it. And it's now where mainstream media never has to correct anything.
Right. Yeah, they just move
They just
on. And it,
move on.
like, the Wuhan lab leak hypothesis, I think, was such a stark reflection of this. When it went from being that this is a conspiracy theory, like PolitiFact fact check that it was unfounded conspiracy theory, and then all of a sudden Fauci's like, maybe it did come from a lab. I don't know. And then all of a sudden, all the mainstream news sources are like, oh, maybe it did come from a lab. That should have shown everybody very clearly who they consider to be an authority. And when I was in news, that was definitely the case. If the Department of Health sent us a press release, we would pretty uncritically just share it.
Sure.
And but if it was like you wrote me and said, hey, I have this source that's telling me blah blah blah, or maybe you're the source yourself, you're giving
Right.
us inside information somewhere. Well, we would need secondary and tertiary sources to make sure that you were not lying to us. So we would hold the outsider to a standard we would not hold the Department of Health to. And now imagine, you're a reporter who doesn't have a lot of time to do the checking on the secondary
Right.
or the tertiary sources. Well, then that person's just never going to end up on the news, because you don't have time to do what you need to do for them to make it through the cheese grater. Whereas the Department of Health, you can just throw it. So guess who ends up on the news all the time? The Department of Health, because they're seen as the authority. Why? To be honest with you, I'm not really quite sure, because every journalist should know the track record that the government has with manipulating the public and not telling the truth and trying to get people to do certain things that maybe 5-10 years from now end up being terrible for us. So yeah, so it's like one of those things where I don't know if we're institutional, they're institutional. It's just birds of a feather flock together, or if it's risk, litigious versus risk reward, and we don't think that we're going to get sued over what the government says because the government told us so. So whereas if you told us like, oh God, that could be scary. I don't really know, but I can tell people for sure that the government is often one of the most trusted sources of information for mainstream newsrooms. That's why you see them take former CIA directors or whoever else and put them on as contributors. Just as like these people haven't lied to Congress or whatever else. There's been plenty of, but
Right.
then they become contributors for a mainstream newsroom as if they're telling the truth. It's just very odd. And to say I didn't do that would be a lie. When I was asleep and didn't realize what I was doing, I was just like, oh, today the Department of Health said this. In fact, I have a video on my channel talking about a doctor that I totally um defamed, really, because I just repeated the Department of Health talking points, and we couldn't get him for an interview for a little while because like the press release often comes out at 5 o'clock or 4:30, so you'll just run with it. And I just trusted them. Like what they were saying was right. And this particular doctor, it was a much more complex case than that. And his patients really got kind of screwed because of what happened with that whole case. But we had to get it on at 5, and we trusted the Department of Health. Now, keep in mind, if the doctor had written us at 5 o'clock and said, hey, the Department of Health is doing screwy things to doctors here that don't follow their particular protocol, you think we would have just run with that at 5 o'clock? No, we would have waited till tomorrow to check with the Department of Health. We would have like done all the research. No, but when the Department of Health writes us at 4:35 o'clock about, their characterization of a doctor, we just do it. And we don't care if we just ruin somebody's entire career. We just move on to the next story.
What is the purpose of your YouTube channel? What is the ultimate purpose?
I think it's to give people a better understanding of how mainstream corporate newsrooms work so that they will have a healthy fear of it. Okay. And I just mean that I saw over the last few years, and this is really the reason I started talking about this, because frankly, before my Airstream renovation, my husband and I are renovating an Airstream. That was the focus of my channel. It was non-controversial. It was fun. Everybody liked it. So to get into this world and the comment section now, and it's just a dumpster fire, it comes with its own new level of stress. So,
Sure.
but the reason I do it is because I started noticing like, you know, grandmas were not invited to Thanksgiving anymore. Or, people are like saying they're going to, these kind of people should be tied up and shot. Like, wait a second, those kind of people, like, where did this come from? How and it made me realize that like, it's because of this messaging constantly, our oversimplification. Like I told you earlier, we oversimplify the issues. We don't know what we're talking about, and we're selling it to specific audiences. That's a pretty dangerous combination. And the last few years showed me what the real consequences are for communities, for families. And, I don't have the bandwidth right now to do really deep investigative journalism, to necessarily always counteract the mainstream narrative. Sometimes I do. Sometimes, I have people on who are being censored, and I feel like that's real journalism. I'm doing that. The rest of the stuff is media analysis, just so that people will walk away and say, wait, why did I unfriend that person on Facebook again? Like that's what that reporter was doing when they did that article that made me, make one or another lifelong decision, which I never should have put in the hands of mainstream corporate news because they don't know what they're talking about. And I don't even do it to like a lot of people, and I think this is part of the reason why like the mainstream news world doesn't respond to the criticism, because a lot of people think that it is this intentional, like highly groomed manipulation scheme, which, yeah, on one hand, like we talked about the mainstream, like the big cable newsrooms and how they're courting a particular audience. And that's a fair, criticism of them. But the vast majority of news you're consuming, especially if it's put forward by a reporter, and especially if it's a local newsroom, these are people who are like cogs in the wheel. They're just repeating stuff, and many of them, even like they're not thinking they're trying to take over America. Okay, they actually really believe what they're doing is good and righteous. And so what I try to do is not just for the public, but for any journalist who might come across my channels to say, come on, level with them. You don't know what you think you know. You don't know what you think you know. So let's be a little bit more humble about silencing the voices of dissent. Let's be more humble about what we're presenting to the public. I joke that if newsrooms could end their newscasts by saying, and this is what we could figure out today, but we really didn't have a lot of time. So take it with a grain of salt and good night.
That would be great.
That I would be much, much better with. It's the pretense of authority and gatekeeping, like that's what bothers me. It's not that they exist at all. It's that they exist acting like they have this great wealth of information and are flawless with their fact checking and all these other things, and that they should have the control over speech as if they deserve that, like they really believe that. So the ultimate goal in that regard for my channel is just so that people watching, again, maybe some of them are journalists, say, okay, maybe I should start doing my own research. Maybe I shouldn't unfriend grandma. Maybe there are things out there that I didn't think about. And also, like, when it comes to having the voices of dissent on, it's to normalize once again that journalists, people who are not necessarily on the fringe, they're not conspiracy theorists, can talk to people who have scary ideas. I want to normalize ideas again. I've said before, ideas feel like this new STD. Like if you hug somebody with ideas, you're going to get AIDS now. Ideas are not going to kill you. They're just ideas. Now, could you have a bad idea and do something terrible with that idea? Of course, but an idea is just an idea. And now, journalists have been some of the leading critics of ideas in the way that they're like, stop listening to ideas. You shouldn't know ideas. You shouldn't know what the dissenters say. You just shouldn't know. And I'm like, that's crazy. Journalists have to know what these people are saying. How can you possibly come up with a counter argument for something if you don't know what the other point is? There's no way to know that you really think something unless you know what the adversary that you're allegedly critiquing is saying. And journalists now are proud about not knowing. They're just proud of that. And it's totally nuts to me. So that's my second counterpoint, is to just say, hey, I'm not somebody who came from, a cave somewhere that's been talking about flat earth or whatever. I'm like a mainstream, gingerbread house kind of like, just take me home at Christmas to meet your parents type of person. I'm
Yep.
totally mainstream. And I talk to these people who you've been told are dangerous. I'm not telling you to agree with them. I'm not telling you to disagree with them. I'm just telling you that talking to people is okay. It is okay to talk to people who have different ideas. And if mainstream news is making you feel like you're going to get leprosy or something from having a conversation with somebody who's different from you, then you got to stop listening to them tell you that and go figure it out for yourself. Like, let's just like normalize ideas again. That's my great hope.
That is a fantastic closing right there. And I really hope that people do listen to that advice, and they do listen to other people, and they do listen to ideas, because that is really, really critical in everybody's well being and certainly their thinking. Allison, is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have, or that you would like to
Probably.
share?
But
I'm
I
sure I
can't think.
have.
Yeah, but I'm happy to come back anytime to if you think of anything else. No, I mean, I would say, like, you can go to my YouTube channel, but beware that some of my videos I cut short because I have been suspended from YouTube. They reverse it when people got mad at them, but I've realized that I'm not going to beat YouTube at YouTube's games. So I'm also on Rockfin. I'm on Locals, I'm on Odyssey and Patreon, which has its own issues. But, if you're interested and you're on one of those other platforms, I would say find me there. If you're on YouTube and you're cool with, going and just seeing 10 minutes or so, that's fine too. But just so people know that, I have a lot more content on some of the other sites because they're less likely to kick me off.
Links below to the other ones.
Yes.
I'll try it.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for your time, Allison. I really do appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
All right.
Thanks for listening. Find us on YouTube and Facebook at the Intellectual People Podcast and online at theintellectualpeoplepodcast.com. Check back for exciting new episodes.